This is Artistic Intelligence, where we explore the intersection of art, sustainability, and technology. This show is brought to you in partnership with the United Nations ITU AI for Good, Changing the Story podcast, and State. Now let's join your co-hosts, Neil Sahota and Michael Ashley.
Hey, welcome to another episode of Artistic Intelligence. We've got a fantastic guest today, Maella Clarke. She is an Australian conductor, multi-instrumentalist artist, and artificial intelligence strategist based in Helsinki, Finland. Her artistic practice uses data, algorithms, and AI to create compositions, sound, and sonic art that can also be used in live performance. Participation and inclusion of the audience and non-skilled musicians in collaboration with skilled musicians is a feature of her work, seeking to blur the lines between performer, composer, and audience. Maella, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here, Maella. For our listeners, would you tell us a little bit about your story and your background and how you became to be the artist that you are?
Well, it started off as a pretty traditional childhood learning instruments. My mother was an opera singer, so I didn't get out of it too easily. And I started with piano, and I went through different instruments of clarinet, piano, violin, viola, oboe, flute. And I guess as I became a teenager, I started to realize I really love the orchestra. It's my thing. And so I started to pursue conducting studies. Basically, a long story short, I couldn't find very much job, a very stable job as a musician. And I started to look at doing postgrad work, and my life just led me to Finland. And basically, it just turned out that when I came to Finland, there was a mix-up. I was this musician, and they had put me at the Finnish Forest Research Institute to do my internship, and I had no background in forestry whatsoever. But long story short, it meant that I had to go back to university, because in that time I met my husband, and I had to go back to university and to stay here, and I did a Masters of Science. And that's really how I entered the profession of consulting with a focus on climate change and forestry. So then I was working in quite many countries around Asia and Africa, looking at how to reduce emissions from deforestation, food security issues, biodiversity issues, and I had a career in that. But when in recent years, I was thinking, look, this digital transformation, this is amazing what we can do. And I think I really wanted to do that career pivot, and I did. And I realized as I was doing that career pivot, but I need to be creative as well. And it just led me to start experimenting with data, because I was working in a company, I still am working in a wonderful company called Dine Studios. We focus on data and AI. And of course, your typical assignment is maybe it's marketing, or maybe it's human resource related, or maybe it's maybe solving a problem for industry with artificial intelligence. But in my spare time, I started playing around with all these new skills I'd learned. And that's how I started thinking, we could do something with music and art with these new technologies. And I guess it was that experimentalism where I started, you know what, I don't care if I'm a composer or not. I can just produce this stuff, and I just tried different techniques. So that's how it kind of led into this data sonifications and these artificial intelligence artworks, and then of course you develop them as you experiment further. So yeah, that's the long story, I guess, in a few minutes.
Yeah,
that's interesting. So you combined a lot of different things together, and it sounds like you've tapped into AI for some business stuff, but also for art. I'm kind of curious, because you're doing something like the sonic art, and you got like a very participatory across the board type of performances. How did this come to be, and what is it like? Like, can you describe it for our audience?
Yes, I can. So I guess at first I just thought with the sonic art, I was taking the sound art and sonic arts module at the university just to open my mind. I was interested in it, and I started thinking, all right, I'm working with data. What would data sound like? I mean, we hear, I saw some really impressive data visualizations, but I looked at everybody around me and it's like, yeah, it's cool, but it doesn't make you feel anything. And then I started this conversation with my colleague. When do you feel data? And he goes, well, he gave me the example of a Geiger meter. And he said, well, all I know is that if I was walking around a radioactive site, I'd want that particular sonification to work. Basically, his point was that we do use sonification in data. It's actually used to alert us. And that's when I thought, well, that's what's really missing in all these amazing climate change data visualizations. We're not alerted by them, even though their message should be certainly alarming. We're facing an existential threat. And yet it's always delivered with such silence, or you don't feel anything from it. So I guess I set out this task. What would it sound like? I mean, the possibilities are endless, but it means that you want to draw attention with sound to the data visualization. So I started experimenting with, snow depth data in different sites from Finland, saying, well, I'll just do the basic, as the snow depth goes up, the pitch can go up. And I have a series of these compositions, marimba in the snow, and it's based on the locations from different data. So, that's on SoundCloud. But of course, when we talk about, how do we involve people in this? So now we have a data visualization, and you can see the snow depth data change over the snow season in that particular location. But what we can do with that data visualization is give people instruments and say, how does that data make you feel? Express it in the form of an instrument yourself. You don't need to, it can't be right or wrong. There's no right or wrong on this. So it's about actually taking it a step further and saying, all right, let's forget the traditional conventional music notation. Anyone can actually perform these data visualizations and participate in that sonic art.
It's so interesting to hear you say that, because I was talking to somebody the other day. Her company deals in big data, and she was saying how boring data is, or at least it was for her to communicate it. And so I grew up with Star Trek. That the Next Generation was more my time, and then we had data right on the show. And so I think when you, for the general audience, the mainstream, when you bring up something like data, the natural tendency isn't to associate art with data. They seem to be very incongruent. But I was wondering from you, how is it possible to use something that may seem so clinical as data, and then combine it with art to do something that's emotionally affecting? How can data make that leap in such a way that we feel emotionally connected to the art, especially the art that you're creating?
Yeah, I think first of all, that was the challenge I saw. I saw that, you can have quite alarmist data visualizations. And as you say, you're right, they're very clinical. They're perfect. I mean, they're made to be, there's so many standards on what makes statistical visualization, appropriate. Of course, we always give it in this scientific context. And in science, we're always worried about our credibility. And when you talk about, well, if you put the words "that's an emotional scientist" in the same language, you're going to come up with people will be like, "Is that scientist credible?" An emotional scientist. I think that in the field of science, we try and think things. We try not to feel things, and I think that's where there's a disconnect between science and society. And where art comes in, you see, the artists, they're very similar to the scientists because they're both experimental in the inception of, you have science experiments and you have art experiments. And those art experiments usually lead to a work or a concept, and you can take it further. But what you have in art that you don't have in science is that freedom of losing credibility just because, you might explore an imaginative thing or a concept outside of its normal bounds. And I think that's when we can start playing around with emotions. There are certain, for example, musical tones that can make us feel things, whether they be happy or sad. And the composers have known about this for many centuries. And they've used it to make us feel that way. And I think that, as we progress with our art form, in when we bring in data, now we've got a new kind of aesthetic emerging. It's like, what makes beautiful art when you use these tools of data and AI? Because I completely agree with your friend. When you look at this art with the data, well, it starts off usually in an Excel spreadsheet or in a Jupyter notebook or a Python, or the cloud. They're just numbers or they're letters. They don't mean anything. And yeah, it's really boring. Can I just say, like, all of that data, nobody cares about it. It's what you do with that data that people care about. So when you have this artificial intelligence in your art, you do need the data. You can't bring it from nowhere. It might be an image, it might be a text, it might be numbers. And I think it has to have some kind of meaning. Where I find, the data sonification process has meaning is that you're taking something and you're alerting people to the certain changes. So, for example, with the Marimba in the Snow series, it was based on the snow depth of last year, you hear that there's a sudden decline in pitch. And that sudden decline in pitch, when you explain it to the audience, that actually this decline in pitch is rapid snow melt. And what you're hearing is it shouldn't be like that. If I'd done the sonification for 20 years ago with the same algorithms, you wouldn't have that rapid decline in pitch. And so I think that, it's, first of all, you have to have meaning when you do this data sonifications or data visualizations and to call it art. It's not simply enough to just say, all right, here are the results. I'm going to keep myself credible. In fact, you've got to break beyond that and really experiment.
Maella, I feel like you're actually pulling the earplugs out of my ears, and I didn't realize I was actually wearing earplugs. I actually remember being in Sydney probably 3 or 4 years ago and actually seeing a demonstration about the impact of climate change with the waters rising and flooding around the world. And like visually, it was very spectacular. And now thinking back to it, I'm thinking like, but the silence was kind of deafening in that, you hear the narrator talking about this stuff, but you don't like hear the sounds of like the flooding and the other things. And now that you're talking about like sonic art, I'm like, whoa, you know what? That would have made the experience a lot more powerful, maybe a lot more visceral too, right? How come we don't really think about these things? It doesn't seem intuitive.
I think that, there's a need to have a little bit more participation from the society in the art making. Quite often, so far our aesthetics in art have been very much focused on the performer, the composer, the artist, and this has been either one person. With digital technologies, we see teams of people, collaborations happening. But I think we need to think bigger than that. When it comes to this kind of art where you're wanting to make a statement, and a meaningful statement about whether it be the Sustainable Development Goals, an environmental issue, you have to involve a lot of other people in the making of that art. And I think, for example, the idea, if I explain another artwork of mine called Failure as a Service, Climate Change, and the idea of this particular art is, yes, you have this typical Earth temperature anomalies evolve over the course of the last century, and you see the 21st century really in the red, we're having the hottest years on record. But it means, again, it doesn't really get to people. But if people, for example, start recording sounds of emissions and recording the sounds of impact, of climate change and uploading it and it gets tagged as this sound art, then they've actually participated in something that, they're able to say, well, I was part of that big effort, a global effort to make this art. And I think that then, they tell their friends about it and their friends go and listen to it. and you have the network effect in place technically. And so I think what we're going to probably see is art expand beyond the artist and become, not so egocentric in there can only be one right, but actually that everybody starts really being able to have the opportunity to participate in the making of that art. And I think that's going to come into our aesthetics as well.
So far we've been talking a lot about the technology aspect. We're talking about how this actually comes to fruition from a music standpoint. I want to back up and talk a little bit about you as an artist. It seems like the best artists out there really stand for something. They have a worldview and a vision. And clearly you care very much about the environment, but I wonder, what is the vision? What do you stand for as an artist, and what do you want to share and communicate to the world?
Well, first of all, I think that I've got always this love for the 5 Ps. I did a little bit of work with the UN back some years ago, and we were always, these values of the 5 Ps. The Ps are planet, people, prosperity, partnership, and peace. And I think that is probably what I always look to as, that's the ideal. We want to be a prosperous place. We want to have people be able to enjoy the environment around them in a socially safe society. And so, and we can only do that really in partnership, and to have peace is the ideal. For my own personal values, love of life is probably the core of what my art is about, what my call is about, is, we should be able to love life and be able to bring that be able to share it with people. I think that, to be able to call yourself an artist, because I had a lot of trouble doing this, I felt like I'd given up on music and pursued a career in science, and then come back to art again. And I found that transition between scientist and artist, I was like, I feel like a fraud sometimes, and this imposter syndrome took over. And I guess, it was like, what makes an artist? And you can make the most incredible pieces of artwork that people will discover probably when you're dead. But if you do not share that with anybody, then how can you say that you're an artist? I think that as an artist, if we want that title beside our gravestone or beside our business cards or whatever, you have to be willing to share it. That means opening yourself up to a lot of criticism. But I think that, being willing to share your ideas, your concepts, and your art and your processes is part of being an artist.
I think that's absolutely critical, and I think we tend to lose sight of some of that. I know that when we chatted earlier, we were talking about, like, sometimes science gets too hung up on methodology, right?
It does. Yes.
So, it sounds like we all really need to be part artist, part scientist. Is that the balance?
Yeah. It's like it's a tricky balance, because I think that there's the scientists, they fear artists sometimes. First of all, they want to make people feel something, not just think, because thinking is important in art. But, when you go into the science of, where we're going, and we're talking about medical breakthroughs, we're talking about biomedical engineering, we're talking about really serious stuff. And I guess at the end of the day, scientists, they want to experiment and they want to get results and they want to do something good with the world. But what really drives their results and what really drives their project, at the end of the day, being realistic, it's the same as artists, it's money. You've got to make a living. And I think that a lot of compromises start to happen after you've graduated university and you're in the career. You start losing what really made you want to be a scientist. So I think that a lot of the science that we see is definitely driven by money and profit. And I think that this is where the artists, they've stayed a little bit stronger to their tune. They kind of even romanticize, which I don't like either, but they romanticize the poor artist. And if you're a poor artist, you're true to the core. I think that that's where you have this extreme imbalance in terms of, artists and science, and being able to bring them together is when you can be able to create a kind of level playing field where both can share ideas without this fear of being discredited. I think that when human beings, when they come together and they're very different in different disciplines, they're afraid of criticism, and they're afraid of judgment, or they just don't want to be judged negatively. We all want to be told we're doing a great job. And at the end of the day, it's that nobody wants to be told, like, your art is terrible, But at the same time, that's an impact for an artist. It's like, well, my art was terrible. It's maybe for that person, but maybe for another person it's not. And I think that's being able to create that playing field where we don't say art is bad or art is good. We shouldn't really judge it like that. The scientists, on the other hand, they're saying, well, that's a result or that's not a result. And it's this spectrum of extremes that everything's black and everything's white. And in the field of science, you can test your hypothesis. You can test, all right, did it work? You can see whether you've made a good result or not. A good result, what is a good result? An experiment could be a good result. And perhaps that is where the artists and the scientists can meet in the experiment stage.
So for people that aren't as familiar with the work that you're doing right now, I wondered if you could talk to us about a few of the pieces that you're most proud of and walk us through the process and what they mean to you.
Okay, so I guess the first piece that I was really, when I started playing around with the tools for artificial intelligence, I found OpenAI, and they had this new kind of experience where you could construct a piece of music based on adjusting a few parameters with artificial intelligence. And I started playing around with it. And I came up with this piece called Reinventing Tchaikovsky. If you like, I can play a little bit for you. If
Sure.
I go to this Reinventing Tchaikovsky, and we can hear it now. I'll just leave that there. But that is actually the first piece I made with this help of this algorithm, MuseNet algorithm. And I showed it to my friends, and I was like, oh, am I a composer? Am I a composer finally? My compositions to this point were, oh, look, I can say I was very discouraged at school. Like, no, you shouldn't do composing. That's not for you. And I believed them. But then I was like, 20 years later, oh my goodness, I can compose now. And then I showed it to my friend, and he's like, oh wow, that's really amazing. And I was like, yeah, it is. And then I showed it to a friend who was a musician, and she was like, that's not composition. You're not a composer. And and I was like, I started thinking about it, and I was like, yeah, I'm not gonna put composed by my Majella Clarke here. I'll put created, because I started to feel like a real fraud. I was like, if I use the word composer, I'm 100% fraud using this artificial intelligence to compose music. And I was like, oh gosh, this is controversial stuff. The more I would share it around with people, they would say, this is really cool. But then I would say, yeah, a machine did it. I had to make decisions for that machine. So I had about 20% of the artistic input on something like that, and the machine had 80% input. But I think what it does is it reopens the debate on, is creativity being replaced with artificial intelligence? So I started playing around with this algorithm a little bit more. You can do a lot of things with this algorithm. And I think that I thought to myself, well, if I was a film composer, for example, and I had deadlines to make and I had to produce lots of things in a certain form, in a certain style, this might be my go-to tool. it's certainly evolving in a very, it makes composition process efficient. You have quite a bit of control over what you're still generating, but at the same time, the machine is doing a lot of work for it. So that was my first experience, and I came out thinking, all right, I'm not a composer when I use this tool. I'm a creator of music, and I feel like a fraud, simply put. So then it was like, all right, what else can I do with artificial intelligence? And it started getting me, all right, we've talked a little bit about the sound art and sonic art experiences where we're taking visual aspects of scientific data and we're creating sound with them. And I think that, we've already discussed that, so we won't go into that too much. But then I do have another example where we're able to start thinking about how can we use artificial intelligence as a tool to actually enhance our art as artists. And my first example of this is using an interface that we developed at Dine Studios called Nama. And it was demoed at the Slush Festival last year, which is a festival for startups in Helsinki. And this is a computer vision API that uses an emotional recognition with the face. So, you come in and it will show you when you stand in front of it, whether you're 20% happy, 40% angry, and maybe 60% neutral. Well, it should equal 100%, but it does this recognition of facial emotions. And in addition to that, it uses explainable artificial intelligence. Our data scientists took the algorithms out of the black box, and you can actually see how this particular API makes the decisions and how it arrives at that result where you're 20% happy. And I took this particular interface and I started playing around with it, getting experimental again. Yeah, let's try this on a few things, and came up with this composition concept that's been submitted. I don't know whether it will be performed, but it's called Facing Nama, and it's for 2 orchestras. And one orchestra actually has is using this as they're generating these facial emotional recognition results, and the other orchestra is responding to the information that it's getting, and they play their music based on those emotional recognition results, and they've got certain instructions to be able to play the music to reflect, is this happy? Is this something that should be fearful and angry? Because in music, that's actually, we have certain ways to make people feel excited in music. Film composers do this all the time. I think that, you can make suspense out of a simple dung. The way it's played and the sound that's made, you can make people feel suspense. I think the most famous of this actually is Jaws music. Right. It's you don't know where it's going. And so I guess this is a new way to revisit music making, is we're adding that interface in there that's already picking up the emotional cues on the face, and then we're able to translate that into a live performance. And so I think that is I guess a composition and concept that we're using now artificial intelligence as part of the technology as part of the performance.
Can I ask a quick question? What is it? I don't have a musical background, because you were talking about the distinction between being a composer and then you said created by. What does it mean to be a composer then? What is the distinction between the two, please?
That is such a good question, because it changes for me. Sometimes I think, all right, am I a composer or a creator of music? With this Facing Nama, it's a composition, and I would call myself a composer for that, because I've developed a concept from nothing, and I've actually been able to create music based on that concept. When it comes to the composition, we look at the data input. And the data input for the Reinventing Tchaikovsky is actually a MIDI. It's some 170 hours of virtuoso piano playing so that's the data. Mm-hmm. And then that's then reinterpreted and rearranged through this MuseNet algorithm. And I think that's when, now you are using this algorithm to, like a jigsaw puzzle, construct the music. And so, yes, you're certainly having a creative role in it, but the composition process starts with a conception, and what are you putting into that conception? And I think that's where your role as a composer starts. So with this facing Nama composition that I have, it's conceived. I'm using rules and algorithms that would define that composition process. And then the outcome is something that I cannot anticipate, actually. It's not unusual where we have a discussion on, are you a composer and are you a good composer? Something I don't really ever like to say, are you a good composer or are you a bad composer? But there will be people that debate that. But if we go back to 100 years ago, 1913, there was a lot going on in Europe. And they had this very famous series of concerts, and I guess one of them was the Scandal concert in Vienna in 1913. And basically the program was not finished. People walked out, and they were in such an emotional state of outrage, because this is now when the composers have taken it too far and they're using a series of rules to define what the music comes from. And as we evolve through that 20th century music, we see that algorithms play a lot of role, and matrices play a lot of role in the construction of music and the composition process of music. But it always comes back to the concept. And the concept is, you might be able to use a matrice or a set of rules, but those set of rules will then define, your output. And that's you're still using your thinking, and you're still using your concept as the foundation for that performance or for that composition. So we see, for example, Stockhausen use a lot of rules in his music, and Xenakis used IBM computers to generate his music. But at the end of the day, he would take that generated music and say, let's apply the concept of game theory, and you get these compositions like Strategy and Duel for two orchestras and two conductors, where they're competing against each other using the rules of game theory. And so basically he took that output from the computer and he notated it, and then he even elevated it further into a very complex composition process. That is a composer. But when we just say, all right, I'm pressing the button, here's a little bit of input, and here's my output, am I a composer? Well, I would say that depends. It depends what you do with it. If you just leave it like that clip, then the computer has generated it for you. And perhaps, whether you're a composer or just a creator of sound, that would be up for debate. But if you take that further and bring it into a deeper concept where it has some meaning, then I think that's when you're able to say, all right, you're a composer, you're able to do something with that sound clip that you've generated.
That's actually interesting, because, when I was working with Alex the Kid, he used IBM Watson to compose the song. It Ain't Easy. And he actually did that. Watson analyzed the sentiment analysis of what's going on in the world in terms of news and stuff. But it's not like Watson necessarily wrote the music or anything like that for him. But he really was hesitant to call himself a composer. And I thought that was interesting, because we started chatting about it, that, Watson and AI, they're not really creative. They can't really imagine. Right, they only teach you what we can commoditize, right? And it's like filmmaking. Like every film, I think, falls into 12 archetypes. And so we were kind of having this debate about it, and he was still hesitant to call himself a composer. And I didn't know if it was like an artist thing, or if there was a feeling like, well, if I don't actually create the whole thing, or there's a piece that's inspired, or some chord or something that's done by a machine, I really can't lay credit to create that piece of art. Is that like a kind of the sentiment right now, or is it is there something I don't understand about the artist world? I mean, I was a little surprised by that.
Yeah, I think it comes to I think that we've got a new technology, a new way of making music, and we haven't kind of had our full discussion on aesthetics yet. First of all, is that new way of making music, is that reflecting our society? I think we're still very much in the early stages of experimenting. And in that experimental process, we sometimes feel more like scientists. I don't know whether you've seen this, but there's the brain opera. And I think that they have these headsets on, and they're generating music, or I shouldn't say music. I mean, what's music? But they're generating sound and a performance. Let's call it a performance. They're generating performance based on their brainwaves, and I think that's. For is that a composition? Absolutely, yes, because you're at the concept, and I think that's where the humans really come to collaborate with the machines very nicely. Is we've got so many concepts that we can explore in our art, and of course, your life is only so short. Some people think it's long, but in the history of the universe, 100 years is not a long time at all. So, you've got all of these great ideas to explore in your life. And, I think people quite often feel like they don't have enough time to write it all out, to make it happen and to propose it. And I think what artificial intelligence can do is play a role in, we can shorten that timeline it takes for us to produce our art, but of course play a major role as human beings in that conceptualization, because, a concept can happen like this. I've got a concept, or it could take actually a very long time to develop. So I think that, I think we've got to have that discussion about, where do we draw the line? I don't know if there is a line, why define a line, but I think it's still a very interesting discussion to have, like, all right, is that a composer or a creator of sound and music? Or is it a scientist? I mean, who knows, in 20 to 80 years from now, maybe we don't have these job titles anymore. We don't have this way of creating things anymore. Who knows?
Actually, I want to jump on that. So we're talking about some very cutting edge things, especially for a lot of people that are not as well versed as you are in this world. What do you think is coming maybe 10 years from now, 50 years from now, based on what you're dealing with, what you're working with right now? If you could make some predictions, what is it going to look like in terms of the music realm, based on this new technologies and the way that people are working with them?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, first of all, I kind of think, well, COVID has taken a massive toll on the performance industry, events industry, arts and museums. So let's assume that it gets back on its feet fairly soon, so that we can make sure artists do have a major role to play in our society. I think over the next few years, and perhaps even driven by COVID, we are going to be having that at least in Western society, we're going to be having that discourse. What role do we want for arts to play? You see a lot of these educational programs, really enforce the STEM, science, technology, engineering, maths. And, there's a little bit of a movement to get to move STEM to STEAM, where you have arts in there. We see a few lighthouses, so to say, with being able to do that. But, when we compare the arts funding with the funding for science, you can't compare, and even for artificial intelligence, the science just eclipses and here and here, it's arts and science. And I think that, we, at the same time, we need to have a discussion in our society. What role do we want arts to play? Because it plays a really important role in innovation, driving innovation, but also alerting and having, being able to explore a spectrum of perspectives as a society. It creates discussion. We're not discussing the latest scientific results from MIT, but we'll certainly have a lovely discussion over MIT's brain opera, or, city symphonies. I think we've got to have that discussion in the next 5 urgently, as soon as possible. But and I think that will arrive at that point where we want to see artists and scientists work together. So what does that mean? I think that really opens up a lot of possibilities when you have artists and scientists work together and they share these very different skill sets that they've come up with. And you've got these evolving technologies like AR, VR, MR, and then society desperately wanting to have more from their artists. They want immersion. They really want immersion. A question I quite often ask ourselves, however, is we've made the consumption of art very individualistic and personalised. So, for example, we see a lot of people with headphones on, and that's you have silent discos in Europe, where you have people with these headphones in a disco. And it's silent. They're receiving that information through their heads and they're moving to it. But it's an odd thing to see where in absolute silence, people are really going at it as if they're in a disco. It's quite a paradox. I think that those technologies are going to play a role, and then this need for individualization, because if we look at where artificial intelligence is going over the next 5 to 10 years, we're really going for targeted, personalized, customized experiences and immersive experiences. If we bring art into that, so what does that mean? It means that we're going to be understanding what people like, and that draws into our discussion on aesthetics. What do people like? What do people think is really beautiful? And then being able to give that to them. And I think that artificial intelligence will help us take our art and tailor it to a certain deliverable that can make people feel the way that they want to feel. And I think that that's where, a lot of, at the moment we see this, brain waves being done in the art, this brain opera, and you see emotional recognition being done in computer vision that can, make us respond to, like, we know how people are feeling. So we're able to then craft our art towards that. And I think that, being able to understand a depth of emotions and being able to design the art for that will be a place where artists and scientists are going to collaborate in the next 10 years. But I also think that we're going to be asking ourselves some pretty existential questions over the environment and over how we want to live on our planet. And I think that when we ask ourselves those questions, we've got another reason and another calling to make sure our art is heard and felt, so that, it gives the scientists a platform as well to be able to share their results and say, look, guys, we thought, if you go back to those climate projections 30 years ago, we look at what we have now, we have to update our projections. We're on a much higher pathway than we thought we were 30 years ago in terms of our emissions. And maybe we find out in 10 years from now we're on 6 degrees warming by 2100. I mean, that's a very daunting reality. So what does this mean for the responsibility of scientists and artists? And the scientists, as we know, have this struggle with being able to get society to understand what this really means. I mean, as a scientist, being in that position, the number of times I've had to put my head on the table and think, oh my goodness, it's like, can't you see? and it feels like you're hitting your head against the table. It's like, why is there so much resistance? But then when you take a step back, you realize actually that not everybody has a science degree to start with. They don't have advanced knowledge on science. So how can they make sense of carbon dioxide parts per million in a graph that gives over time series? I mean, it's not to be condescending on the general public, not at all, but actually just cognizant that it's taken a lot of skill to actually develop that graph and to understand it. And I think that the role of the artist is to say, all right, well, artists are actually very intelligent people, but how can you translate that into the type of form where it is digestible and understood by the rest of the society? Now, up until this point, it's been the journalist's role to really try to get that through. They've failed, I'm sorry to say, but we are not changing rapidly enough given the urgency of climate change and biodiversity loss. So I think, maybe there's going to be a new room for artists and innovators to be able to respond to that particular crisis. And I guess it's another area where I see artists and scientists coming together to be able to help communicate the urgency.
Well, I think given everything that's going on, you're doing some fantastic work. And I think you're really shedding the light, especially on climate change. And I love the personification, or the sonification, I should say, of data. Can you give us a sneak peek on what your next project is?
Okay, yes. So I'm here, ready with my lovely instruments. So give me a little bit of a moment while I stand up and reposition the video. And I just want to talk a little bit about this. This is a project by Google AI and AI for Social Good and NOAA in the States. I don't know if you've seen it, but they have some, over a year of hydrophone recordings in the Pacific Ocean picking up whales, humpback whales singing. And when I saw this, I thought, oh, wow, this is so cool. I mean, it's a very elegant data visualization. And what I'm going to do with this is I use this as a background to play, and what I'll do is I'll start improvising on instruments, and it's I guess whatever comes to my mind is what we're able to come up with. It's just an experimental. See this as an experimental performance, and that I have no music prepared. I haven't practiced. It could be an absolute disaster. Let's hope it's not. But maybe just a minute of playing, and I'll just go to it now. So I'll just stop it there.
Bravo, bravo.
It's just more making sounds and responding to what you're hearing on different instruments. And I'll just stop sharing my screen now. Stop share. There we go.
Well, that was fantastic, Maella. I've got to ask, I think our audience would love to learn more about you, your performance. Can't wait to see your next one. How can they stay in touch with you, follow your latest developments? What's the best way to, stay in touch with you?
Yeah, I'm a very open person, so I'm on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. Artists never want to say they're on LinkedIn, but yes, and every now and then I will do these types of performances on based on these improvisations that accompany data visualizations, and yeah, I try and make a little bit more sound about them. But SoundCloud is also another space that I also will put up these types of performances.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure all that information is in the show notes for our audience. Maella, thank you so much for being on Artificial Intelligence. This has been absolutely phenomenal.
Thank you.
Maella. Hey, if you like today's show, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment.
If you've been enjoying the Changing the Story podcast series, please subscribe and share it with your friends.
Thank you.